What is it doing kind of outside this morning? When you went outside, what's it kind of doing outside?
Raining.
Yeah, it's kind of rainy. Remember last week, it rained so much at our house I had a little trash can sitting outside. And then one day it was empty because I needed to wash it out. It filled up this much water in one day. Isn't that amazing? That day that hurricane thing was coming through. Well, for more than 3 years, it didn't rain. Could you imagine what it would be like to have like those hot summer days for 3 years with no rain? What would that be like, Eleanor?
A famine.
Well, yes, it would be like that. Well, for more than 3 years, it didn't rain, and there was, yes?
It would be like a desert too.
Oh, it would be like a desert. Why?
Because it's so dry and it never rains.
Right, and we need rain for what to grow?
Flowers.
Flowers.
Plants. Trees.
Trees.
Fruits.
Fruits.
Vegetables.
Vegetables. Grass.
Unicorns.
Wheat.
Like
Wheat.
wheat. Everything to grow.
Animals.
Well, it didn't rain for more than 3 years. And there was this king, his name was King Ahab. And King Ahab was so angry that it didn't rain. But he was angry at a certain person, and the certain person's name was Elijah. And last week I think y'all talked about Elijah being hid by God. Was that right? Did I hear that right? So God was hiding Elijah out. Do y'all remember that? Is it coming back to you now?
Yeah.
He was hiding Elijah. And Elijah was listening to God, and he was obeying what God wanted him to do, right? Well, after about 3 years of no rain, God told Elijah, okay, come out of hiding. So what did Elijah do?
Come out of hiding.
He obeyed God again, right? So he went towards the city where King Ahab was. And King Ahab, they always had people to watchtower, to see who's coming up to the city, to see if they were going to be attacked or whatever. But it got back to King Ahab that Elijah was coming to the city. And King Ahab, he got all in a huff. Have you ever been in a huff? Do y'all know what that means?
It means you're so angry.
Yes, he got all in a huff. And he goes running out, and he runs up to Elijah, and he says, "There you are, you old troublemaker of Israel." And Elijah's like, "Well, I'm not the troublemaker of Israel. You're the troublemaker of Israel." And Ahab was like, "You're the troublemaker." And Elijah's like, "You're the troublemaker." And they went back and back a little bit. Well, Elijah was very brave to speak to King Ahab this way, because at that time, if you talk to somebody, we're Americans, we have freedom of speech. They didn't have freedom of speech. If they said something mean to the king could have them
Confiscated?
killed right then and there. So the fact that Elijah was standing up for what God wanted to the king was a very, very brave thing to do. Well, does anybody remember, or did y'all go over this, why God wasn't happy with what was going on in King Ahab's area, land, kingdom? Thank you.
Because he didn't believe in Jesus and he was making foolish decisions.
Yes, he was making foolish decisions because he was worshiping these idols. Y'all know what idols is?
A stone god that isn't real.
Yes, any kind of God that isn't real can be an idol, okay? Or anything that's taking worship away from God can be an idol. Well, Elijah said to him, I'm going to read this, God's people are going to have to choose whether they're going to worship God or whether they're going to worship Baal. And bring the prophets of Baal, and we're going to have a little showdown. Okay?
I remember.
You know where I'm going with this? So, the prophets of Baal are like, okay, that's what we're going to do because our prophets are better than your God. They were quite certain of that. Well, so they go and they build. The prophets of Baal already had their altars built, and they were sacrificing, and they were ready to go. So they're setting everything up. And remember, at that time, they did kill an animal, and they put it on the fire, and they would set everything on fire and to worship God. But they had asked for the, yes?
And it's called a sacrifice, right?
Right, it was called a sacrifice. Exactly, you're so smart. But they asked Baal to send down fire. Okay, well, in the meantime, the prophets are over here like, oh, Baal, send down fire, send down fire. Oh, and doing whatever they're going to do. They're dancing around, and they're singing, and they're shouting, and everything. Well, the altar to God was nearby. And it hadn't been used in a long time because the people of this area had turned their back on God, on the one true God. So they were fixing up the altar and getting it ready to go. And hours later, Baal still hadn't sent down fire over here on this altar at all. It's still just sitting there. So Elijah,
On the other hand,
starts taunting a little bit and maybe teasing a little bit and saying things like, hey, why don't you yell louder? Maybe those gods aren't hearing you. Yell a little louder. So you know what they did? They yelled a little louder. And then he said things like, maybe Bill's taking a nap. Maybe he can't hear you. He's just like giving it to him, if you know what I mean. Kind of like at a football game if two teams are taunting each other a little bit, you know? And what's happening over here? Does anybody know? What's your guess, Jake? Nothing. Nothing's happening. The prophets are getting a little more agitated. They even went as far to cut themselves, which don't ever do that, cut themselves with their swords to try to get Baal to send down some fire. This is going on for a very, very long time. We're not talking like 10 minutes. We're not talking about an hour. We're talking about all day. So, Elijah, he's over here. He's ready to go.
and he prays to God, and then...
Well, before that, you know what he did.
Yeah.
Now remember, water was pretty scarce. That means that there wasn't much water anywhere. So, he's like, well, let's pour some water on our fire. So he dumps water all over the fire. And then he's like, let's dump a little bit more water on the fire. And you know these guys over here are getting a little angry, I could imagine. Wouldn't you think? What do you think, Isla? They're kind of like, oh, Baal, send down the fire. But, so then they dumped even more water on the fire. Let me read what it says. Oh, he repaired it. He put 12 stones around it. He arranged the wood and the meat and dumped all the water on it. 4 large jars. Now the jars, if they're what I'm picturing in my mind, they're like stone. They're very heavy and they're probably big. You know those buckets, like a big 5-gallon bucket? I imagine he poured several of those 5-gallon buckets on there. Yes?
Is it like the shape of it going skinnier up?
Yeah, that's kind of what I picture in my head. Okay, well, there's still no fire over here at Baal. Okay? Elijah prays to God to send down fire on his wet wood and on his wet animal. Because is it hard to catch something that's wet on fire?
Yeah. No.
Yes, very hard, very hard. And what happens? kaboom! Fire just came right on down on the fire. Now, what do you think the prophets of Baal over here they're thinking now?
Maybe we should obey God instead.
Exactly right. You know, we're kind of on the losing team over here. Maybe we should obey God instead. And you know, many people that day turned their heart towards God. Even, I don't know how they could possibly still believe in Baal when they're cutting themselves over here and they have the dry wood. They have everything that seems to make sense over here. And they're still turning their backs on God. But a lot of the people, they turned their heart towards God. And that made God happy. And you know what God allowed to happen in that land? Rain. And don't you know that land was like, not that land is a person or has feelings or whatever, but I imagine the trees going, oh, that feels so good. Like when you...
Like the trees having a shower?
Yes, like the trees having a shower. Like if you are really, 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 really hot and sweaty on a day and you went and your mom says, come on, we're going to go jump in this pool. And you're so hot and you're so sweaty to the point that you're almost even a little grumpy and you jump in that swimming pool and you're like, oh, this feels good. I know the land probably felt that way. But the people turned their heart towards God. So and God blessed them for that. And that way they were able to grow more food. They were able to live a better life, right? So